Okay, we're right around the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Megan Kevel, a co-coordinator for the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. In case you're unfamiliar with the network, we're one of 15 regional fire science exchanges funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. The Northern Rockies Fire Science Network delivers science and provides opportunities for engagement between managers and scientists about critical fire and fuels topics in the region. To learn more about resources and opportunities we provide, you can visit our website at nrfirescience.org. And on behalf of our team and our partners, I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Unraveling the Complexity of Mixed-Severity Fire Regimes, New Insights from 3 Rocky Mountain Ecosystems, presented by Dr. Cameron Naficy. And so before introducing Cameron, I'll review a couple of webinar housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode for this webinar, but you can ask questions of me or our presenters at any time by typing them into the question or chat pane of your webinar control panel. These questions will be addressed following the presentation. Whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the presentation, so feel free to type a test message or test your audio at any time. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network website and YouTube channel soon after the conclusion of the live webinar. All webinar attendees will also receive an email with a link to the recording once it's available. So with those logistics out of the way, I'll move on with introducing our presenter, Cameron. Dr. Cameron Naficy is a postdoctoral scientist in the Tree Ring Lab in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences at the University of British Columbia. Cameron's research focuses on understanding ecological dynamics across scales. He uses a combination of remote sensing, photogrammetry, dendroecology, plant physiology, and field methods to understand ecological dynamics across multiple spatial and long time scales. So with that, I'll hand this over to you, Cameron. Thanks so much for being here today, and go ahead and begin whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks Megan for organizing this and for having me, and to the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network as well. Let's see if this advances here. I'm going to be talking today about some overarching themes and findings from work that I've been doing over the last several years in a variety of different ecosystems, all in the Northern Rockies. This was a nice opportunity to kind of take a step back and think about some of the work that we've been doing and what we've been finding that's similar and different between these different systems. And so I've tried to structure this talk around some of the bigger pictures and larger themes that have been emerging from this work. The specific objectives for my talk today and kind of the flow of this talk, we'll start with a little bit of a discussion about what mixed-severity fire regimes are, some concepts and some definitions, some language. I find that sometimes the language surrounding this topic has contributed to some of the confusion and discussion about mixed-severity fire regimes. Then I'm going to talk about some of the, I think, important advances that have been made in this field, some of which we've been working on and contributing to, some of the basic ecology of these mixed-severity fire regimes as we found them in the Northern Rockies, and using this comparative framework specifically because I think it's a really rich framework for understanding what are common between different mixed-severity fire regimes, what are the differences, are they one sort of monolithic thing, or are there a lot of variability within that catchphrase, mixed-severity fire regime. And then I'm going to walk through 4 specific case studies that I think represent some really interesting findings of our work on a large scale. So to start with some of these concepts and definitions, if we think about severity as a concept, referring specifically to tree mortality, and severity is a metric of that, I want to talk about how we define it and also how we sample it and sort of draw these two strings together. So most of you are familiar with some of the basic terminology, low severity being a fire that would create, or a point in the landscape that's affected by low severity fire being one that experiences low severity, low tree mortality, for instance. You can put different thresholds on it. I put here less than 30% mortality, moderate severity being one where intermediate levels of mortality occur, and high severity being where all or most of the trees are killed within a stand. And we can think about this as I've represented here at the scale of just an individual sample unit in your landscape, right? So for any point in the landscape, this could be a dendroecological plot, this could be a pixel and a raster. We could use this framework to describe, and we do commonly use this framework to describe what happens at individual points. And what happens is that it begins to get confusing as we begin scaling up to larger spatial scales, using alternative terms or thinking about temporal scales. And so that's what I want to lay out here. So if we were to scale up each of these points in a landscape, we could describe entire fire events, as I've shown here. And so then you could talk about a low severity fire or a moderate severity fire, which is also sometimes called a mixed severity fire. And I think is part of where sometimes the confusion comes in, or a high severity fire. So this is just scaling up all these points in a landscape and beginning to describe particular events or time series, which is what I'll talk about in just a moment here. One thing that's important to think about when you look at any of these DNBR maps or modern fire severity assessments is almost all fires have some mix of severities. And so there's been criticisms of the term mixed severity fire as being potentially not a useful term because it seems that there are very little of these extremes where you just have one or the other. But an important thing to think about, as I'm trying to illustrate here in this graphic, is that the term the fire regime idea really is specific to vegetation types. It's not something that it's important that we think about this the same way that we study this when we go out into the field or when we're doing these analyses. And really one of the most important frameworks for this is the vegetation type that we're talking about. That's illustrated on these slides here, where you have a burn severity map, you have a vegetation map, and if you then look at the severity distributions that we would get from those, you see real differences that, at least in part, explain why we see variability in severity within individual fires or fire years. That doesn't necessarily translate to every point on the landscape or every forest type in the landscape experiencing mixed severity regime, right? So this is an important distinction to make when we're thinking about this and trying to think about this using different data sets as well. So I've been talking here about some of the spatial components of fire regime, and there are temporal components that are also important. If we look here at a landscape with a particular patch in the middle, it could be our sample unit. For a given fire event, the first fire that we observe at this site, it might have a low severity impact. Second fire might have a moderate severity. The third, a moderate severity, and a fourth, low severity. So this is just going back in time through the series of fires that have all occurred at this one sample point, or sample patch in this case, and quantifying what the severity of each of these events were. And by doing that, we can begin to talk about a temporal fire regime. In this case, the term that I'm using for this talk and for a lot of our data analysis is a non-stand replacing regime. So when all of your fires are a mix of low and moderate severity, we've given it this term non-stand replacing fire regime. And you can go through and do this for different mixes of severities over time. So here's what we call a mixed severity fire regime. This is one where you have a mix of both low, moderate, and high severity. You have to have each of, you have to have one high severity fire at least and a mix of non-stand replacing fires in order to be called a mixed severity fire regime under the terminology that we're using. This is a moderate severity fire regime, so this is one that would be similar to, for instance, a lot of Paul Hesberg's work from the Pacific Northwest, where he's talked about moderate severity fires and what he calls mixed severity fire regimes, being these regimes where fires are predominantly resulting in intermediate amounts of tree mortality, and then one that's just predominantly high severity. Right, so these are the different types of fire regimes that I'll be talking about today, temporally integrated fire regimes that I'll talk about in my work today. And once you've done that for any patch or any point on the landscape, you can then scale this up to your study areas or to your study watersheds and begin to talk about where in the landscape these different types of temporally integrated fire regimes have occurred. So this is a way of bridging both the spatial and temporal scales that are so important to mixed severity fire regimes in particular. I'm going to present just a little bit here on what we've done in each of these study landscapes where we've been working. We've tried to adopt some of the framework that I just laid out for you and carry it all the way through from our sampling through our analyses. So what we've done essentially is place dendroecological plots throughout the landscape where we're able to best understand at those points in the landscape the fire-mediated dynamics that were going on. This is simple data about the age structure and information about the fire regime that's happening at each of these points. Each of our plots have been nested within these patches that we've defined on the landscape using historical aerial photography. A lot of this work started out through collaborations I've had with Paul Hesberg and some of the work that he's done quite extensively throughout the Pacific Northwest and Interior West, using historical aerial photographs to try and understand what landscapes look like and how that can then help inform us about the disturbance impacts and dynamics that were going on in these landscapes. So we nested our dendroecological plots within these patches, pairing therefore the spatial information that is so robust in these historical aerial photographs with the temporal information of our dendroecological sampling. And we did this for a series of watersheds throughout the Northern Rockies. This allowed us to understand not only things that individual plots and then patches, but also within individual watersheds, and really place things within a larger landscape scale and begin to scale up from these finer and finer scales to more intermediate scales. It also allowed us to develop some statistical models, which we'll talk about later, between the vegetation characteristics we see on the landscapes and the disturbance dynamics that are evident from the dendroecological samples. And then we did this for about 104 different watersheds throughout the Northern Rockies, which allowed us then to really scale up our interpretations and address both the spatial and temporal components of mixed-severity fire regimes across quite a large region, and apply the statistical models that we developed at the watershed scale to help us do some of that. So that's the general study design that we followed for each of these different study areas. And there's some real benefits to the way that we've gone about this, I think. In particular, we've been able to stratify our sampling by both vegetation and environmental gradients that we know are very important to how these systems function. And it's really been an important part of how we efficiently sample the landscape that's allowed us to cover in our dendroecological sample, which is very intensive work, a broad gradient of disturbance histories, of biophysical settings, and so on, and therefore has provided us with a larger, a more expanded scope of inference than is generally possible with dendroecological, other types of dendroecological designs. And some of the benefits of this when we get to the analysis stage is that we can really look at how fire regimes vary across these broad gradients. We can begin to map within landscapes where different dynamics may be occurring. We can evaluate explicitly some of the drivers of fire regimes across these biophysical gradients, which are of great interest. You can see in this graphic here where I've plotted climate space for the Northern Rockies in general. And our sample within this has covered quite a broad gradient of the climate space within the Northern Rockies. One area that we haven't sampled in yet is this drier, warm, dry zone. So most of what I'm going to be talking about today is in these intermediate moisture conditions or cold, dry conditions, which is what our Yellowstone sites represent. By pairing these different data sets, we also can speak both to the spatial pattern and the temporal depth of these regimes, which is really what's been so difficult to address. It's been one of the real major challenges in understanding mixed-severity fire regimes. And then by having this very pattern-focused data in the aerial photographs and a very process-based data set from dendroecology, we can begin to link both pattern and process in a much more direct way, in some cases explicitly through some of the modeling work that we've done. So these are the areas that we've been working in, and the three ecosystems that I'm going to be talking about. In the north here is the southwest foothills of Alberta. In the center is the western portion of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. So this is predominantly the Flathead National Forest. And then in the southern part of our study area here is the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So that's the geography of our study system. And looking at our specific study systems, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem is one that is characterized by a really strong gradient of dry to moist mixed-conifer forests. It's relatively diverse in terms of species composition for this region. You can see our sample sites here scattered throughout on sort of a north-south gradient throughout the Flathead National Forest. At lower elevations, you have ponderosa pine and dry mixed-conifer forest, and you move quickly into more moist mixed-conifer forest, and then cold forest as you get into higher elevations. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we sampled just in the northern portions of the GYE. We were focusing specifically for all of these studies on the lower to mid-montane forest types. So in the NCDE, it was mainly that ponderosa pine, Doug fir, larch, and some of the lower elevation lodgepole pine forest. In the Yellowstone ecosystem, we've been working exclusively in these low to mid elevation Douglas fir forests. These are relatively pure Douglas fir forests that are intermixed with grasslands oftentimes, and there's been very little work done in these forest types before, so this has been an interesting system to study, and I'll talk about a little bit more about the ecology of these systems and what we know about it or don't know about it a bit later on. What we did not work in here, which is what Yellowstone is most well known for, is the lodgepole pine forest and spruce fir forest. So we were really looking at these lower elevation systems that represent about 30% of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in terms of their area. So they're an important part of the system. And then here, the Alberta foothills is a project that I'm currently working on most intensively. We've been working in the lower montane to mid-montane portion of this ecosystem. It's an ecosystem that is bordered by the Great Plains on the east and transitions in through a short span of Douglas fir forest, very similar to the Yellowstone ecosystem, and then quickly moves into a lodgepole pine dominated system at even lower to middle elevation, and then spruce fir forest higher up. And we've been working specifically in that lower to middle montane forest, not so much the higher elevation lodgepole or spruce fir. I'm not going to get too much into many of the methods that we use here. I want to talk more about the content, but I felt it was necessary to describe at least conceptually how we are addressing severity. This is one of the newer frontiers within dendroecological research. There's a lot of movement going on about how to understand severity in increasingly robust ways. Essentially, what we wanted was an event level severity metric. So at each of our sample points for any event, any fire event that went on, we wanted to be able to understand what the severity of that fire was. And what we've come up with essentially is a way of using tree survival as a proxy for severity. There's some work that Alan Tepley has done in a great paper published in 2015 with Tom Veblen, where he developed a series of equations. I'm not going to show those here, but basically it's a density decay function that is based on how density decreases for any given site with a given number of fires. So you can imagine as you go back in time and you increase the number of fires that a site experiences, its density will decline with each fire. The number of survivors will decline. And that is essentially proportional to severity. And there's a lot of details in terms of the calculations and how we deal with the problem of fading records, because we only know what survived. We never know what died. And that's one of the real problems that we have to address with this type of historical work. I'll refer you to the paper for any of the details, and we can talk about it afterwards if there are specific questions. But what I wanted to really just show is conceptually what it is we're doing essentially for each of these sites, where we have dendroecological data. And it's represented here by this red dot, and the black dot is two separate sites. And you can see they started at a certain density and decline during the first fire for a certain amount, a similar amount. So this would suggest that they experienced a similar severity. And then in the subsequent fire, you can see the red dot drops far below the black dot. And this would suggest that that was a higher severity event at the red site. And this is essentially the idea of what we've been doing for individual fires. And this is just showing you a little bit of the data that we've actually been using, so you get a sense for what it looks like. The red bars there, dashed vertical bars, are fire events, and the severity is indicated as coded down here at the bottom, associated with each fire. And the bar charts then are establishment dates with different species. Represented by different colors. So you can see, for instance, here a high severity event followed by a low severity event. I will point out that our fire histories usually extend further back than our fire severity metrics can. in most cases, you can record fires from individual trees, but you lose the age structure data that we need to create severity. So I'm going to get into some results pretty quickly and talk about the ecology of each of these three systems. Starting here with some information just about fire frequency. On the y-axis here, you'll see median fire intervals. And then what I'm showing you here for each of these different systems, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, the Greater Yellowstone, and the Southwest Alberta foothills, is a gradient of forest cover types in each. Not each of these areas has the exact same forest cover type, so you'll see some empty boxes there. What you find within the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem is it had some of the most diverse forest types, as I mentioned earlier, of any of these different areas. The fire frequencies in general for this area were what I would call intermediate. They're not as frequent as you see in warm, dry environments, sort of a classic ponderosa pine ecosystem, for instance. If you look at the medians for these dry mixed conifer ponderosa pine forest, you'll see that they might be, there are most frequent fire systems within the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, but they're still not quite as frequent as we've documented in other places for dry mixed conifer ponderosa pine forest. This gradient here goes through dry mixed conifer ponderosa pine, dry mixed conifer Douglas fir dominated forest, and then these two categories here are pure Douglas fir forests for the most part, one being associated with dry site species. These are usually on rocky slopes or unproductive soils. Moist mixed conifer forests. These are mixed wood forests here, usually a mix of aspen with conifer, lodgepole pine, and then Engelmann spruce forests. So that's the gradient of forest types that we've been dealing with. Within the NCDE, you can see quite a lot of variability for most of these different forest types and a slight increase in fire intervals as you move along that gradient. For the Yellowstone ecosystem, a much more restricted set of forest types. Really, we were working with relatively pure Douglas fir forests, or in some cases, Douglas fir mixed with a little bit of lodgepole or other dry site species such as limber pine and juniper. But the vast majority of these forests are represented by these pure Douglas fir forests here that have intermediate and somewhat variable fire return intervals. And then in Alberta, interestingly, we see very little variation between the different forest types. And one of the explanations for this is that the landscape mosaic in these lower montane areas where we were working is such that these different forest types were all juxtaposed over very short spatial scales. So they were heavily intermixed, and that explains, I think, in part why, at least in terms of fire frequency, there wasn't a huge amount of difference. And the other important point to note is how frequent fire was in these ecosystems. It was fairly frequent, and it wasn't as variable as it was for some other different forest types or different study regions. If we turn now to look at the severity patterns for individual events, what I've plotted here is just the percent of samples for each of these different regions and each of these different forest types that were in that were found to be of low, moderate, or high severity based on our dendroecological data. Within the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, you can see that high severity affected about 25 to 50% of, or was documented in about 25 to 50% of all of our sample points. Low severity effects were more prevalent within the drier portions of the forest type gradients. And there's a number of interesting things that stick out in a couple of these different regions. For instance, moist mixed conifer forests in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem experienced a fair amount of high severity fire, but they also experienced about more than half of our sample points recorded low to moderate severity impacts. So actually a really important role for non-stand replacing fire, even in these moister environments. Within the GYE, in these drier Douglas fir dominated forests, we actually had less frequent fire, but also lower severity fire. And I think this again is due to the fuel limitations from these sites that were located on talus slopes and areas of low productivity soils. But for most of the ecosystem represented by these pure Douglas fir forests, what we found was quite a lot of high severity fire. About half of our sample sites were recorded high severity fire, and the other half of the events were a mix of low and moderate severity fire. And within Alberta, we found essentially similar patterns with the Douglas fir and moist mixed conifer forest compared to other regions. And with the lodgepole pine forest, which dominates the forested area in that study ecosystem, we found, again, and this is to be expected, quite a lot of high severity fire, but we also found around 30% of our samples recording low to moderate severity fire. So there was a mix of fire severities, even in these forests that are considered traditionally to have been predominantly high severity fire regime systems. And if we look temporally at how these mix of different severities occurred within individual patches, and we just characterize each of these patches using the system I described earlier for non-stand replacing or non-lethal fire regimes being those that only experience low to moderate severity fires, moderate severity regimes being those that only experience moderate severity fires, mixed severity regimes being those that experience high along with some non-stand replacing effects or just high severity. What we find was that there were actually no low severity sites, so no patches that experienced only low severity fire. And there were very few that experienced moderate or non-stand replacing fire regimes. The majority of patches within this landscape, in fact, all of these landscapes, was mixed severity fire regimes over time. And what that means when you consider that our mixed severity classification means that a high severity fire occurred there plus non-high severity fires. Somewhere upwards of 80% of each of our sample patches within all of these regions experienced high severity fire at some point within the sample record, which extended about 350 years ago or so. And what this suggests is that there was non-equilibrium patch level dynamics occurring in each of these different ecosystems across all of the different forest types represented by the gradient that we have here. For the Northern Continental Divide specifically, you can see an increase in the proportion of sites affected by or characterized by high severity fire regimes alone, increasing most in the moist mixed conifer forest types. And you can see that even the ponderosa pine forests, interestingly, were predominantly of mixed severity, right? So most of our ponderosa pine sites at one point within that 350 or 400 year record that we have had experienced at least one, if not more, high severity fires, whereas only a few of them had experienced predominantly non-lethal effects. Within Yellowstone, these pure Douglas fir forests had a much higher percentage of high severity fire than similar systems in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And the same in Alberta, there was actually an interesting effect in the Douglas fir forest where in general there was high severity fire, but many more low and moderate severity fires mixed in. So they had a much more strongly mixed fire regime than they did in similar forest types in Yellowstone. And in the lodgepole pine forest there, you can see a significant proportion of our patches experienced a mixed severity fire regime over time as well. This is just an example of what some of these different classes look like. In this first column, you can see two examples of non-stand replacing fires that have relatively frequent fire and much older forest overall with many cohorts. These mixed severity stands, generally what they look like, they were young to intermediate age forests that had experienced, like I said, at least one high severity fire, but then these subsequent fires that were of low to moderate severity. So they were young, but they were oftentimes multi-cohort, and I'll show you some data on that in just a second. And then these are just some examples of our high severity sites, which could have been young or in some cases intermediate or older age. So they could have different ages, but they would have just resulted from a high severity fire. When we actually look at the stand data here, what you see overall that's striking is that these landscapes, each of them from each of these regions, was really dominated by younger forest for the most part. There's more or less variability in some of these forest types that I'll talk about, but the striking thing for me was that the predominant stand ages were under 150 to 100 years old. at around the time when fire exclusion ended in each of these study areas in around the 1940s. So that's not particularly old forest. And in fact, if you make some comparison, for instance, between the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem and the Yellowstone ecosystem, where the NCDE had higher fire frequencies than the Yellowstone ecosystem in general, what you see is that the result of that is actually older forest, more old forest in the Yellowstone ecosystem as a result of less frequent fire, right? So this is somewhat flips on its head the idea that the more frequent fire is, the more you maintain old forest in a landscape. In these landscapes where high severity fire is an important component of the fire regime, if you increase burn rates, you actually decrease stand ages. And if we look at a similar question about the distribution of large trees or old trees on the landscape, this is using the photo interpret, the aerial photo data for our study region. What you see here in the legend is we color-coded all small trees in this creamish color, and then increasing canopy cover of large trees that the size class of which we calibrated using our dendroecological data in these warm colors here. What you can see is, number one, a lot of variability. But number two, look at the amount of area in these different watersheds where there was a complete lack of large trees or a very patchy amount of large trees. And these patches were sometimes represented by contiguous patches of what you might call old growth forest. Oftentimes they were represented by these small scale clusters or very fine scale patches of old trees within a matrix of younger forest. So this is also a very different model, for instance, from say an old growth model from the Eastern Cascades or Eastern Pacific Northwest, which seem to have been dominated by a much more important amount of older, larger trees. Here we're just looking at the age structure summaries for each of these sites. You can see for each of these study regions and in many of the forest types, there's a real mix of simple, even-aged age structures along with double or multi-cohort age structures as well. In general, for each of these areas, there's an increase in the amount of even-aged forest as you go along the gradient of forest types. If you look at some specifics for each of the systems, the Northern Continental Divide has within the ponderosa pine forest had a really interesting split, and it was kind of a geographic split between the Swan Valley and the Spotted Bear area, where in the Swan there was much more older multi-cohort ponderosa pine forest that's consistent with the general literature on ponderosa pine forest ecology. And in Spotted Bear we found a lot more young single and double cohort, or even multi-cohort in some cases, but it was much younger forest, and I'll show you some of that data in just a little bit. And again, looking at these moist mixed conifer forests, one of the things that jumped out is really how diverse they were, both in terms of their fire regime and the age structures that were produced. Within the Yellowstone area, again, we had more intermediate aged forests here, slightly older forests within the Yellowstone area in general, and it had quite an even diversity of age structures represented. Within Alberta, there was substantially less even-aged Douglas fir forest within the pure Douglas fir type than there was, for instance, in the parallel vegetation types in Yellowstone. And within the lodgepole pine forest, this mixed-severity fire regime that we've documented there was creating a mix of predominantly even-aged forest, then mixed in with some of these double and even multi-cohort stands within lodgepole, which is not something that's been recorded very widely within the literature for these forest types. I want to talk briefly about some relationships that we've been finding between fire frequency and severity. It's oftentimes the case that they're conflated, so where you have more frequent fire, fire severity is thought to have been sort of necessarily of lower severity. And so it's easy to walk into a forest such as this one in the Spotted Bear, where you see frequent fire and lots of fire scar material on the landscape and a stand structure that looks like you see on the right there, and assume that it was a low severity fire regime. But when we actually have gone in and looked at the data, what we've seen is this pattern emerging in some cases, where you have relatively frequent fire, but the age structures and the severity patterns that we infer from that are, the age structures are generally younger, and it suggests that they've experienced a fair amount of high and moderate severity fire, not the classic low severity model associated with frequent fire. And when we look at this across all of our different sites, what you see is a fairly consistent relationship that I think is pretty interesting. So in general, what you find is a nonlinear relationship between fire frequency and this fire severity regime. Most of the sites recording high severity did have longer fire intervals, and that's consistent with the literature. But what you notice when you compare sites with mixed or non-stand replacing fire regimes is, I think, two important things. One is that the medians are actually quite similar, right? So just looking at something like median fire frequency may be misleading. What seems to be more important in distinguishing these fire regimes is the variability around those medians. And that's something that makes inferences of fire regime or fire severity from fire history data, for instance, or just fire frequencies, quite difficult. So what the actual shape of this nonlinear trend is really important and hasn't been well documented before. So this is an important, I think, finding that, especially given its consistency across each of these different forest types and study regions. So I'm going to jump now into some of the case studies that I want to talk to you about, where we reveal, I think, some of the more interesting and broad-scale lessons that we found from these different systems. First, I'm going to talk about some of what I think are novel resilience mechanisms that we've been finding in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem and the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'll talk a little bit about the geography and spatial patterns of mixed-severity fire regimes over a much broader scale in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, where we have a very rich data set. Then I'm going to talk a little bit, sort of going back to methods, about the importance of using and continuing to develop quantitative metrics for fire severity, and how they allow us to develop key insights along the spectrum of mixed severity fire regimes, so we can begin to drill down into that term and really understand what it means and where the differences are between different forest types. And then finally, we'll circle back to Alberta and talk about some of the interesting dynamics we've been finding there regarding tipping points in relation to fire frequencies. So for the first case study, there's this idea that's been well developed in the literature that you can have these tipping points from low severity fire regime dynamics to high severity fire regime dynamics. You can have these state switches that can be hard to revert. And this has been a particular concern when we think about the history of land management and fire suppression that have gone on, that has maybe increased the hazard of high severity fire and especially dry mixed conifer forests or ponderosa pine forests. And there's been a lot of worry about this potential switch happening and then being semi-irreversible, or at least difficult to reverse. And we wanted to examine that for this system where we've been seeing such a broad mix of fire severity. So one of the things we did was we calculated the lethal, non-lethal interval for each of our sites that had experienced a mix of severities over time. And what that represents essentially is just the time between a high severity fire and the next fire that occurred when that fire was not high severity. So it was either a low or moderate severity fire. And what I'm showing on the box plots here are just the distribution of those intervals for each of these different forest types and regions. You can see they tended to happen between a period of about 50 to 70, or maybe in some cases slightly more years. So after a high severity fire occurred, within around, depending on the forest type, 30 to 70 years, the next fire was oftentimes of non-stand replacing severity, so lower moderate severity. This was the case for over 60% of our sites. So the majority of our sites actually experienced this dynamic of having a high severity fire and then a subsequent fire not being high severity, but rather low to moderate. And what it suggests to me is that there's an alternative pathway that we haven't really been talking about as much, where they can escape this ball and cut model. They can go from a low severity or a non-stand replacing regime to a high severity regime and then back again. So there's not as much of a barrier there to moving between these two alternative states. And when we began to think about why, we don't have the data to know specifically why this was happening, but our hypothesis is that this has to do with landscape flammability and how it evolves over time with fire, especially time since high severity fire. In Western North America, most of our models for for the evolution of flammability with time since fire have a positive relationship. So that can be a linear or a sigmoidal shape, as we've showed here. And what we think might be happening in these ecosystems is they're burning when they're still in a low flammability state. So if you look at a lot of the modern literature that has examined this topic of fire-fire interactions, what you see is fires tend to be self-limiting over short scales, 10 to 20, 25 years, and even less when you take climate into account. So that's a relatively short time period when fires sort of prevent subsequent fires from reburning. What happens when they do burn into these post-high severity fire landscapes? This is the question that has come to the forefront from a lot of this work that we've been doing. And we've become really interested in what the dynamics of fuels and fire behavior might be in these young post-high severity fire forests. This is an example of one from the Lolo National Forest. This was an area that burned with high severity in 1987. I took this picture 29 years after the fire occurred. So this is beginning to get into that lower range of the lethal, non-lethal intervals that we found within our historical data. And if you think about what would happen in an area like this when a subsequent fire comes through, I think it brings forth a set of very interesting questions. There have been very few studies that have really tried to examine this in detail. There's one here by Dunn and Bailey where they looked at how different fuel components evolved over time since fire. And even this one, which was one of the more lengthy studies, is just barely getting to that point, that range of time since fire that we saw in our historical records. And also, it's difficult to put these different fuel components together and translate them into just a single sort of picture of what flammability is doing and how fires might actually behave. When you think about that for these ecosystems, what you realize is that you've got fire-sensitive trees. These are young trees with thin bark, very low crown base height. There's tons of abundant fine fuels that are exposed to the elements, so they can desiccate quickly and easily. So a lot of these sort of parameters that have been developed and the concepts that have come out of fire modeling research from predominantly mature forests may not apply to these young post-fire, especially post-high severity fire forests. And one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is the heterogeneity in fuels and regeneration and how that might influence the ecological outcomes of fire in these ecosystems. So I think there's a real need to dig into this field and begin to look at these young post-fire environments and try and understand how fires have or will burn in cases where we have these reburns, and people are beginning to do that. These are photos taken by the Rocky Mountain Ranger District on the Lewis and Clark National Forest in the North Fork of the Sun River in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, where the 1988 Gates Park fire was reburned by the Red Shale Fire in 2013. And you can see in each of these photos these areas of low-lying, even-aged forests, predominantly lodgepole pine, that then reburned. In some cases, you can see areas that were completely blown out. So this would be cases where it was burned by high severity in two different events, as you see here. But in many cases, you also see large areas that were either unburned or burned at a milder severity. So this is an example of what we've been seeing in these historical records actually playing out on the landscape now, where we've begun to have enough time to have reburns. And there have been a few studies where they've gone in and looked at these environments after reburn events. This is one by Stevens, Ruman, and Morgan. And one of the things that they find here, if we think about continuing this line of thinking for these areas that have experienced a high severity fire followed by a low or a non-stand replacing fire, they found intermediate tree densities in those that were different from areas that were either burned once or were reburned twice by low severity or twice by high severity. So these are really represent sort of a unique structure or a unique characteristic on the landscape that hasn't been well studied yet. This is only appearing in a few studies. And it's also consistent with what we observe in our historical data. There's a problem with fading record and understanding how density has changed, absolutely. But one of the things we do see consistently, and these are just an example of a few sites, is after a high severity fire, we get sometimes a higher or lower pulse of regeneration followed by these non-stand replacing fires. And if you look at the axes for each of these sites, these are relatively low density stand densities for our study region, especially if you compare them to just a high severity fire and what you would expect there. So what it looks like is these areas that have had a high severity fire followed by a low severity fire may have very unique attributes, and these attributes may be persistent, and they may have some cascading effects that I want to just talk about now. One of them are the ecophysiological implications of having intermediate density stands. This is some data from Bennett et al., who did an interesting study where they found that larger trees essentially were less resilient in terms of growth and in terms of their ability to withstand drought events than smaller trees. So you can see here that the ratio of growth following a drought event was declined. So between your control, between your drought and your control period, it actually declined with increasing diameter. So smaller trees were more resilient in terms of growth to these drought events, and they died at much lower rates as well. This is a study this is data from Mike Shadell from a paper in 2017 that was actually done here in Montana in similar forest types to those we studied in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. This was a silvicultural experiment where they clear-cut areas in, I believe this was in the Flathead National Forest. And then within about 10 years, they thinned them to different densities to then understand how these stands evolved and what their characteristics were as a result of these different thinning treatments. So this emulates in some ways what we think we were seeing in these historical landscapes where there was a high severity fire that cleared off most of the biomass, regeneration occurred at some density, and then a subsequent fire came in, probably not within 10 years, but within these 30 to 70 year timelines, still relatively early within the evolution of these stands, and reburned at a non-stand replacing event. So this is equivalent to sort of a thinning treatment. Here on the upper panels, you can see, I think this was just a control treatment here, and this is one of the thinning treatments that they placed. And this is the historical image after the thinning treatments were done, 10 years after clear cutting, and this is a more recent photo. And what was interesting about this study is they found really strong impacts of these thinning treatments that occurred early on in the development of these stands across a variety of variables. So you can see here how height changed with stand age in these two different treatments. So those that had been thinned at an early age consistently had, across these different stand ages, consistently had larger trees. This is the height to diameter ratio, and for the unthinned stand, which in each of these graphics is the gray bar here, what you can see is that the trees were had larger diameters. So essentially they were fatter trees relative to their height for any of these different thinning treatments compared to the unthinned trees. Merchantable volume was larger in these in the thin stands compared to the unthinned, and mortality rates were lower for the thin stands. So essentially what they documented was these really strong multi-decadal effects of a non-stand replacing disturbance early on in the development of a stand that had been impacted by a high severity event. This is using very different techniques, and we don't know exactly if this translates to the sequence of fires that we're describing, but it may and deserves some further investigation. And so one of the things I wanted to do in thinking about all these differences and how to sum it up is to think about some of the models we have for fire as an ecosystem influence. There have been some well-known ones, such as one put forward by Bond and Keeley, where fire acts as a global herbivore, essentially changing the distribution and the composition and even the evolutionary traits of plants for certain biomes. Or one that we're all very familiar with from low severity fire regime systems, where fire is sort of this spring cleaner that comes through frequently and kills understory fuels and small tree regeneration, augments fire resistant old trees with large bark and the spatial patterns that are a little bit more fire resilient, and sort of instills this low severity fire regime feedback. And in the case of the systems that we've been studying, and I put here one MSFR model because I don't know, again, I'm wary of placing all mixed severity fire regimes within one framework. I think we're really talking about a spectrum here. In our case, though, what it seems like fire was doing was acting as a predator, where it, similar to wolves and elk, as I show in the picture here, was culling a lot of the old forest out of this ecosystem and maintaining mostly younger forest on the landscape. And it was young, but it was complex forest, as I've shown. And some of the important implications of this are both in terms of its resilience as a fire regime, but then also potentially, as I was mentioning in these last few slides, this may cascade down into resilience even at the individual tree level, and therefore the impacts that and the resilience that these kind of systems and these sort of fire regimes may have to other disturbances, such as drought. I'm going to move on to our second case study. In this case, I'll just scale up from some of the dendroecological data and show you how we've done that. We did so by using a structure-based model where we wanted to link the pattern in the aerial photos to the processes we derive from our dendroecological data. And essentially what we did is we used all of the vegetation information in these aerial photos and the variables we derived as predictors for the fire regime. And we trained these models. We used random forest modeling to do this. And we trained these models using the dendroecological data. And we had fairly good results. This is a pretty challenging task, and it's a messy thing to do, to derive disturbance histories from vegetation. But I think we've been able to do it fairly successfully. And this is just an image showing you what this process looks like conceptually, at least. You can see here an area, one of our sites in Alberta, with all the dendroecological data aggregated here. And if you look at individual sites, as we move along from site 1 through site 4, what you can see is areas such as site 1 and 3 that have clearly more recently burned forest and higher severity burns. That's actually reflected quite well in the age structure data. And it's that relationship that we are leveraging for these models. A lot of the relationships that you see in these models is fairly intuitive. If you look at these non-stand replacing fire regimes, for instance, you can see that they were characterized by larger overstory trees in general. They had intermediate overstory canopy cover, so not high canopy cover, but somewhere between 30 to 50% or so. They had very small amounts of small trees in size classes 1 and 2, and greater amounts of large trees, and so on and so forth. So you don't have to go through this panel by panel, but the relationships are somewhat intuitive. But the important point is that a lot of these relationships are nonlinear. And so using rule sets, for instance, to just derive relationships between structural features and disturbance regimes is risky business, to say the best. It really is important, we found, to have robust data to be able to drive these models. And when we apply these models, as we did here, to 5 of our study areas, what we can do is scale up in a really big way that we couldn't do with the dendroecological data. Now we can model these fire regime classes for patches across entire watersheds and begin to understand at larger scales whether the same patterns we observed are holding, what the spatial patterns were, and also what some of the drivers of these spatial patterns were. So you can see here, again, the same lesson that we learned earlier, that mixed-severity fire regimes where the dominant fire regime was important, but you can also see how that changes across these watersheds from dry to wet environments. And then we can actually build models of both the percent area and spatial features, such as the mean patch size and what drives those. And what we found was that both of these features were driven most by median fire return intervals and the biophysical setting, so the moisture setting of these watersheds. So those that had more frequent fire had a lower amount of high severity fire, and so watersheds in drier environments had a higher amount of low severity fire with larger patch sizes and less high severity fire. So we can begin to do some really interesting analyses once we begin to scale this up and increase our sample size and also layer in the spatial component. And we began to do this with a much larger data set across Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho, and Northwestern Montana, where we have data for these forest types that we were studying. We begin to cover much greater, broader set of gradients than we could before. And again, the same pattern is jumping out, which is reassuring, right? This idea that mixed severity fire regimes as I've described in terms of their dynamics and their characteristics, were really dominant across this broad region. And you can see here in some cases, this is again using this expanded data set, that the largest patch sizes were areas that were in mixed or high severity state at the time prior to fire exclusion. In some cases, these were up to about 10,000 hectares in size, contiguous size. A lot of variability between different watersheds though as well. So this third case where I want to highlight how important it is to use some quantitative severity metrics in how we communicate and then interpret results from these sorts of studies. What I'm showing here on the left panel is just the density of trees by the number of fires on the x-axis here. This is the method that we use to estimate fire severity. This is just the average across each of these different study regions where I compiled data. This is Emily Heyerdahl's data from Oregon, Alan Tepley's data from the San Juans in Colorado, and then my Yellowstone and NCDE data. And when we plot this data all together, what you can see are a couple different patterns that are important. One, you can see how density declines and therefore how cumulative severity, what the cumulative severity of fires are in each of these study areas. But you can also look within study areas. So here I've plotted, for instance, Emily's data is here in these green diamonds. This diamond here is, this sample point here is her 2014 paper that was in ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine forests. And you can see how the severity patterns were very different there from the drier ponderosa pine Doug fir forest that she studied in other cases. So again, just placing these data in a quantitative fire regime space defined by fire interval, or fire frequency and severity allows us to really make these quantitative comparisons that we've wanted to. We have lots of cartoons of this in the literature. Attempts have been made to do this before. This is a pretty simple graphic, but it's also very powerful in the way that it quantitatively and between studies is able to communicate the key differences in some of these different ecosystems. And I'll show you that here for pure Douglas fir forest. This is the forest type that was dominant in Yellowstone and portions of Alberta as well, that characterizes actually cold, dry environments across quite a lot of the interior Northwest, mainly within the Northern Rockies of the US here and then central BC. And we have very few studies that have really looked at this ecosystem type, as I mentioned earlier. And so oftentimes models such as that for ponderosa pine have been used. And what I wanted to do here was just show you how we can begin to quantitatively assess some of these differences. Is it a very similar fire regime to ponderosa pine forest or not? And what our data show here, this is just the raw data plotted in fire regime space, and the average is plotted here. As you can see, there's some differences in fire frequency, but the big differences are really in the severity patterns. These Doug fir forests had a higher severity fire regime than the ponderosa pine forest did. And I'm going to turn to the final case study now. And wrap things up. This is work we've been doing in Alberta, and I start this talk out by referencing work done by Westerling et al., where they, in the Yellowstone area and very similar vegetation types, have done some fire climate modeling work that suggests that as a result of climate change, we're going to have lots more area burned and decreasing fire rotation intervals that will become frequent enough to essentially create tipping points in this ecosystem and maybe non-forested conditions over an important part of this ecosystem. One of the things that they don't account for in this study, which is a very evocative study and did a good job of focusing people's attention on this question, is look and dig into these feedbacks that essentially are going to be what dictate the dynamics under these climate-driven increases in fire frequency. And the reason this is an interesting comparison is because of the similar vegetation types. Alberta is a slightly drier environment, as you can see, or slightly moister environment, as you can see here, than the similar forest types in the Yellowstone. So there's some differences, but we can begin to account for those. And the vegetation types are quite similar. And when we look at what the, at lodgepole pine forest in particular, between these two ecosystems, this is just data, metadata, or this is a meta-analysis, I mean, from the literature where we've looked at lodgepole pine forests and how their fire regime and fire frequency has been characterized. In mixed mixed conifer settings, dry mixed conifer settings, lodgepole pine with ponderosa pine or large or Douglas fir. You oftentimes see mixed severity regimes and lower fire intervals. As we move into more moist environments, you see some of those mixed severity fire regimes and some higher severity fire regimes and longer fire intervals. And if you look at the classic model of lodgepole pine forest, it's this long fire return interval, high severity regime. And when we dig into the data from Alberta that was out there, and our own data included, what we've seen is that these systems had very high fire frequencies for this forest type, and a mix of both mixed severity fire regimes and high severity fire regimes. And this is a picture from 1940 showing you what this area actually looked like. Very diverse. You can see multiple cohorts here, multiple very young cohorts, even of aspen and lodgepole, some of which survived a fire, some of which were burned off by a subsequent fire. And we're seeing lots of fire scar evidence in these lodgepole pine dominated systems as well. We can see incredible amounts of change in the landscape over relatively short time periods using some incredible survey photos that exist for this area. This is a picture of the Sheep River taken in 1895. We know that this was predated by fires in 1839 and 1863. And then in 1940, another photo was taken, and the landscape has completely changed form as a result of a series of fires, including some short fire intervals that occurred in this ecosystem. I'll show you some data from this area summarized here. We did some ordination to show, essentially to look at age structure and understand what different types of age structural groups might exist for our sites in these areas. And what the ordination showed was we had 3 different types. There were some simple, even age forest structures, intermediate aged or intermediate complexity stands, and more complex stands that are summarized in some of these graphics here. So you can see the simple classic even age lodgepole pine stand here, intermediate complexity stand with 2 cohorts, and then these much more complex stands that had generally much higher fire frequencies and multiple cohorts. And this is how these different groups were distributed across these forest types in the study area. So again, you can see lodgepole has quite a lot of even age stands, but it also has this important mix of multi-cohort and more complex stands. And we actually did some modeling to address this question of how does fire frequency influence the age structures, the fire regime, and fire severity. Those were our 3 response variables for this modeling, were to test this idea by Westering et al. Of will this result in ecosystem collapse, or alternatively, what will happen under high fire frequencies? So we used fire frequency as our predictors, and we were looking for the types of responses and the location of thresholds if thresholds occurred. In each of our model runs for these different response variables, we had very similar results where the median and the standard deviation of fire intervals were the most important variables. And if you look at the influence of decreasing fire intervals, this would be increasing fire frequency this way. What we see in each of these cases is at around 30 years here, there's this very strong response threshold where age structures move from simple into more complex. Fire severity moves predominantly from high to some lower severity fires. And the fire regime moves from a high severity regime to a mixed severity regime. So really striking shifts at a very consistent point within the fire frequency spectrum. Within this area, we think this had a lot maybe to do with indigenous patterns of fire use. There are high lightning strike densities west of the Continental Divide, but east of the Continental Divide, where this data comes from, where we've been working, it's really a lightning limited system. And so the question is, how did it have such high fire frequencies? Again, these fire frequencies were higher than in many of the other study areas in a system that is traditionally thought to have been defined by this model of low fire intervals and high fire severity. And in our samples, what we've seen is a lot of spring and early summer fires, which again is indicative of potentially of indigenous burning. And it brings to mind a set of really interesting questions about how fire regimes and landscape condition might be driven very differently by indigenous influence if you're comparing a fire adapted system with abundant lightning strikes, such as a classic ponderosa pine model, versus this fire-sensitive forest type in an emission-limited geography. In this case, what we think is that in the case of ponderosa pine forest, indigenous fire use may have reinforced a lot of the patterns that might have happened in the absence of humans, just as a result of lightning ignitions. In this ecosystem, it seems quite clear that that the landscape condition and the fire regime has diverged quite strongly from what might have been there without human influence. And in doing so, it's really revealed some interesting resilience mechanisms that we might not have found otherwise. So that's most of what I'm going to present today. Just a couple conclusions and not system-specific ones, because I tried to summarize some of the system-specific stuff as we went, but just broad conclusions about mixed-severity fire regimes and some of the major points I've been trying to make. One is we need to, as I did up front, because there's some confusion and some alternative methods about how we talk about these and how we define these regimes, we need to be very clear about how we do that and maybe try and work towards something that's a little more consistent. Quantitative methods are just absolutely fundamental, as are using fundamental lines of evidence. These are complex systems. They have both spatial and temporal variability, and it's very difficult to get at that using historical records, using any one kind of historical record. We really need more quantitative studies. The mixed severity fire regime theme has received a lot of attention in the literature, but there had not been as many really robust data sets to evaluate and inform that debate as I would like. And I think that's part of what's contributed to some of the confusion with the term and how it gets used. And then I think what we've shown here is that there's some really interesting dynamics in these mixed severity fire regimes, some new resilience mechanisms, some surprises, and a lot of diversity within what are, even just in this study here, where we've been showing data from 3 different study ecosystems, each of these systems has some really unique properties. So I think it just highlights the fact that the mixed severity fire regime, really what we're talking about here is a spectrum, and the ability to use quantitative data to define where we are within that spectrum and how the dynamics shift over gradients is really one of the most important directions that this research needs to take. And with that, I'll just thank my collaborators and many contributors to this, and I think we'll open it up for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Cameron, for that really informative presentation. We're running a little over time, but if you're willing to stick around for a couple of questions, that'd be great.
Sure.
Okay, awesome. So we'll open up for questions now. If you have a question, again, please type it into the question or chat pane on the webinar control panel. So while we give folks a second to submit questions, I'll just mention that if you have to jump off, as you close the webinar, a brief survey will pop up, and we would really appreciate and value your feedback on this webinar and input on potential future webinar topics. And if you have more questions regarding this webinar, Cameron has kindly provided his email address. And then if you have any questions related to Northern Rockies Fire Science Network webinars and activities, you can see the email address for that on the right of your screen. So let's see. So we do have some questions. All right. We won't be able to get to all of these, I don't think, but we'll do a few and see how it goes. First question, is it possible or probable that low severity fires leave smaller traces of evidence and are less identifiable in particular areas or patches that had more frequent fire applied historically?
Yeah, on the one hand, yes, you would think a lower intensity fire that might be associated with lower severity effects might scar fewer trees sort of within a given area. So yes, I think that's technically true. On the other hand, you oftentimes have so there can be trouble understanding very fine scale spatial patterns within some of these low severity fire regime systems, and that's been one of the sort of long-term focuses of dendroecological research. Within these mixed severity fire regime systems, we have sort of the opposite problem though, really, and that is missing evidence. We have a paper that's coming out that talks specifically about this this dynamic and the problems it creates for reconstructions. And it results from the fact that a lot of these mixed severity fire regimes have more high severity, which erases a lot of this evidence and leaves much patchier distribution of fire scars on the landscape. And because these are intermediate moisture environments, trees tend to heal faster, dead wood tends to not stick around. So I think that the biggest problems in low severity systems generally is sort of understanding finer scale spatial pattern. And we have some fundamental problems with just understanding the fire history of individual sites. So in some cases, we might miss some fires at specific sites. This is one of the real challenges with this work. One of the things we did to try and address that, though, is we did composite all of our data within these patches. That was one of the reasons why we've been using the patch stratification as we have. It allows us to composite our data at a scale that we've evaluated and does not skew our fire history statistics, but does contribute importantly to the information that we have and the reconstructions that we can make.
Great, thanks, Cameron. Can you speak to the limitations of using tree survival as a proxy of severity?
Sure. Yeah, this is what a lot of the debate has been about. The fading record that we have in dendroecological records is highly problematic. And the most elegant solution that I've seen to that is the work that Alan Tepley did, where by pooling data over many sites or over a study region or over many, what you can begin to do is get a pretty good sense of how any individual site for any individual event, how its density decreased relative to all others. And what that does give you is a relative sense of what the severity may be. And this has been the main limitation to his metric, is that it is a relative metric. And we're actually actively sort of working on trying to figure out how to calibrate this best. The short answer that I have at this point is that I think we've done a pretty good job so far for the studies that this has been applied to, where we've had a very diverse spectrum of fire severities. This is where that kind of a relative metric would probably work best. And we're evaluating that now by bringing in more data sets to try and understand how this the metric functions when we bring in larger amounts of data covering a broader set of study areas. But it doesn't erase fundamentally the problem, and I don't suspect we'll ever fully get away from that. So it's a very pernicious problem. There's been a couple of different approaches to dealing with it. I think Alan's approach is in my mind, is probably the best method out there. It's why we've been using it and continuing to develop it more now. But even it has some real challenges. So I glossed over it in this talk because this wasn't a methods talk, but it's hugely important.
Great. Do you have any recommended implications for management in dry mixed conifer forests? Manage lodgepole pine as 2 or multi-age class systems?
Well, I think, if you think back to some of those graphics that I showed of lodgepole pine forest, I think you've got these two models out there. One is the classic model of even-aged, long return interval stands. And the other one has been in the literature for a while, the second model, where you have maybe more frequent fire and potentially even multi-cohort stands and some more mixed severity effects. But it hasn't really made it into the literature in the same way, and there's not many data sets to evaluate regions that have that fire ecology too much. There's a few. Our Alberta work is one. Emily Heyerdahl's done some in Oregon, and there's some other studies I think that are ongoing now that may inform that. But I think there's some fundamental questions about the geography of these different fire regimes for lodgepole pine that haven't really been resolved yet, and just require further study.
Okay, I'm going to make this the last question since we're not going to be able to get to all of them. Are you looking into climate change and its impact on the growth of certain types of trees in a particular area?
I haven't been doing that predominantly in this work. I am doing a little bit of that now in Alberta, and it's something that I'd like to look at more specifically. This idea that I presented that that these sites that are impacted by high severity followed by non-high severity fire might have very different and long-standing growth trajectories and then maybe tree to landscape scale resilience features, that's something that I think is really worth digging into and understanding a little bit more. I haven't done that yet though with these data sets, no.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Cameron, so much for sharing your research and work with us today. We really appreciate it. And for those of you who didn't, we didn't get to your questions, I apologize. Cameron's email is up on the slide here, so if you have a pressing question, he's kindly provided that. So thanks again, Cameron, and thank you to everyone for attending today. And like to wish everyone a great rest of their Tuesday. And thank you.